So today we get into the Middle Ages, and this is our first look at music history. So for most of this semester, we're going to be doing music history. So the first part that you had the exam on over the weekend, hopefully you got that done. If you have not done exam one, by the way, you need to do that ASAP. You have a few more days to get that turned in for credit, but after that, your time is up and you won't be able to get credit for it. So make sure you get that done. But aside from that, now that we are moving into part two, we move into the music history portion of the semester. So we're going to go through several different eras of music. And you may have noticed at the end of chapter 10 in part one, they talked about the different stylistic periods throughout music history. And that's how we're going to kind of organize this. So each part is going to be a different era, or in the case of this part, it's actually two eras that we're going to talk about. And there's actually two different slideshow presentations. Both of those are available in Blackboard for you to find as well. One of them covers chapter one, one of them covers chapter two. So before we get too far into it, I do want to make sure that you know what you need to have done for this 9 weeks, for this 2 weeks, I should say. Gosh, y'all, my brain is not functioning this morning. All right, so I am going to pull up. Pull this back over here for a second. Okay, so if you go to part two, the very top of part two, you will find some information that's going to show you everything that you need to know for this section, for these couple of weeks that we're going to be talking about part two, which covers both the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which is the next era in music. So my plan as far as class is to cover the Middle Ages today and Friday, and then cover the Renaissance on Monday and Wednesday, and then exam two will be on Friday of next week. So a pretty quick turnaround this time. So be on top of stuff. Make sure that you're good to go. Now also, I have divided the assignments for this part into both weeks for the next couple of weeks. So it's not, last time everything was due the day of the exam. This time you have some stuff due this Friday and some stuff due next Friday. Okay, but if you'll notice on here, it's really not much. There's only 4 assignments total for this part. Now they are a little bit longer than the other assignments. So due this Friday, you've got assignment 2.1 and listening assignment 2.1, and those have to do with the Middle Ages. The multiple choice assignment is 25 questions. So it's a little bit longer than the other multiple choice assignments have been, but you only have to do one of them. And then assignment 2, the listening assignment 2.1 has 6 pieces of music on it for this week that I want you to cover. And we're actually going to cover those in class. We're going to talk about them and go over them in class. So hopefully you'll be able to pull those up or at least go back and look and at your notes and get the information that you need for those assignments. Okay, so that stuff is due Friday at midnight, and then the rest of this unit, the rest of this part is due next Friday, the 12th. Okay, and then exam 2 will become available for you on Thursday morning, the 11th, and will be due by 8 a.m. on the following Monday. Okay, and if you want to come and take that in class, you are welcome to take that in class next Friday, the 12th, during our class time. You can come and take it in person. Okay, any questions about that, the upcoming stuff? While I've got this pulled up, those class notes that I was talking about are down here at the very bottom. And then if you want to have the slideshow that I'm kind of teaching from, that is this slideshow for the Middle Ages, and then next week will be in the Renaissance. It has a little more information than you actually need on it because it's actually built off of the other textbook, the full textbook. So you won't need everything that's on there, but it might be helpful to find some of the information without having to dig through the textbook. Okay. All right, let's close that out and drag this back over here, and we're going to go into the Twilight Zone for a second. Here we go. All right. So what I'm going to share with you up here is kind of the beginning of the Middle Ages, the stuff that we need to know about the Middle Ages, right? So there's a few things that it talks about at the beginning of the chapter, just some stuff that was going on in the Middle Ages that we don't really need to worry too much about, that I'm not all that concerned about. And that's kind of the stuff we have here. So let's just kind of quickly talk about this stuff. What is the time frame that we consider to be the Middle Ages? What are the years that the Middle Ages are covered? And you can either type on the document, or you can answer in the chat, or you can talk out loud to me, whatever you want. That's absolutely right. Yeah, it is the years 450 to 1450. So we're talking about 1,000 years of history during the Middle Ages, and this is easily the longest section, the longest era in music history that we're going to talk about. Now, the reason that we cover so much ground in this one era is because there wasn't just a lot of stuff happening. As we get to 1450, we're going to see some shifts start to happen. The Renaissance is only going to be a couple hundred years long. It's going to go a lot faster. And then the Baroque era will only be about 150 years, and then the Classical era will only be about 80 years. So the music starts to evolve much quicker as we get into modern history. And part of that is because there wasn't a lot going on. And another reason that we kind of lump all of this together is because we don't have just a whole heck of a lot of information about music from 450, from the 5th century. There's really not a lot of stuff available for us to study and to learn what was going on. We have a little bit of oral history. We have, by the time we get to the 12th century, we have some sheet music that we can look at, but it's a lot more difficult for us to know exactly what was happening during this time. So, what we're going to talk about here may not be everything that was happening during this time period. We're not really completely sure. We're just going to talk about what we do know was going on based on the history that we have available to us. So, kind of take that for how you will as we're going through this. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, there was some other stuff, and the book will usually mention some other things that happened during the Middle Ages that are important to history. What are some of those things?
The Renaissance.
Well, that happens during the Renaissance, which is next.
People had the right to vote, like men did.
That's true. In areas that had democracies, which were not a lot of them during the Middle Ages. So some of the historical events, some important literature that came around during this time. Beowulf, which you may have studied in your literature classes, was written around 700. The first crusade happened during this time period. You've probably heard about the Crusades before. The Black Death, or the Black Plague, happened during the 14th century, which was during this time period from about 1346 to 1372. And of course, that wiped out, a third of Europe. So pretty major problem there. Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which you may have studied again in literature, was written towards the end of the Middle Ages. And Joan of Arc lived during this time and was executed by the English in 1431. So a few major historic events to happen during this time period. And during this time period, most people were living under a class system. Okay, most areas were ruled by some kind of monarch, some kind of king or duke or something who was in charge of the land for that area. So you had three main classes of people where people lived. Anybody know what those three classes are called? Maybe from your civics classes or something like that? Or if you read the chapters for today? No. So the upper classes of people during the Middle Ages were called the nobility. So that was the top class of people. And the nobility were the ruling class, right? They lived in fortified castles. This is when you think about the medieval era, you think about knights in armor, your knight in shining armor. They would have been part of the nobility, the knights, the kings and the queens and the princesses and all of these, you know, the fantasy that we have about what the Middle Ages would have been like. That is usually based around the nobility. And it's important to understand that that was a very small part of the population during this time. So you have the nobility as the upper class, and then the lower class of just average people were the peasants. Yeah, most of the population, as Lacey says, were the peasants, the peasantry. Okay, the vast majority of the population, and they had miserable lives. They were lived under a feudal system, so they were completely subject to these feudal overlords who were the nobility. They basically spent their entire lives working for the nobility. They would have these small farms, and they would, you know, grow their crops and raise animals, and then the nobility would come and take most of it and barely leave them enough to survive. So basically everything they did was to support the nobility. That was their entire life as a peasant. So pretty horrible situation. You know, if you've ever watched the Monty Python movies, your Monty Python and the Holy Grail is set during this time period, and you kind of get a glimpse of the peasantry as they're kind of questing through the wilderness there. Fair, yeah. As Lacey says, it was pretty similar to slavery, and that's, you know, you're absolutely right. It was the feudal system. Basically, everybody was under the control of, you know, the nobility, and it was very difficult to move away from that. You were probably going to find, if you tried to resist in any way, you were probably going to find yourself executed publicly. And then the third class of people that were separate from both the nobility and the peasantry were the clergy. So what do you think of when you think of the word clergy? What does that have to do with? Yeah, the church. So the Roman Catholic Church were the most powerful organization in Europe during this time period. You know, the Pope was effectively an emperor of Europe. Now, he didn't have direct control over everything, but the Roman Catholic Church exerted a lot of power, and they were really controlling all of the different kingdoms. Every kingdom had some high-ranking clergy that was kind of manipulating the nobility into doing what they wanted. So everything was kind of at the service of the church during this time. The monks, who were the clergy members during this time, had a monopoly on learning. They were the only people that were educated, the only people that could read, the only people that were writing anything. And as we'll find out, they were also the only people that were musicians during this time. So the clergy had a monopoly on learning and on music. So we get into the specific, oh, we already talked about that. We get into some of the specifics of music in the Middle Ages. And as I just mentioned, who were the most important musicians of this time? Right, but thinking more broadly, the most important musicians had what occupation? Hildegard was one of them. Yeah, they were church. The priests and clergy were the most important musicians during the Middle Ages. They were the ones that were really pushing music education. The church officials were guiding these musicians along. and expected their monks to sing and sing very well. They were the first trained musicians during this time period. And most of our early composers that we know of were from the church. Now, Hildegard doesn't come along until like the 12th century. So we're talking even before that. We're way back in like the 5th century at this point. Okay. So your book talked about a couple of notable priests that kind of pushed music along. But basically, you just need to know that most of the music of the Middle Ages was vocal music and was coming out of the church during the early part of the Middle Ages, especially. Okay. So the church itself primarily wanted vocal music. They wanted music, I think the assignment question says they wanted music to be a discrete part of the church service. They didn't want it to be the main focus, but they wanted it to be there, and they only wanted vocal music. They didn't want instruments used in church at all. Does anybody remember why from your book, from your reading?
Isn't it because of witchcraft?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, because instruments were earlier associated with the pagans and with the pagan rituals that had been going on in Europe before the Roman Catholic Church kind of took over. So they frowned upon instruments because of their earlier role in pagan rites and rituals. So even things like the organ, we primarily think of the organ today as a church instrument. That's usually where you hear an organ, but they were even frowned upon. The church officials did not like organs being used in church because they felt like it distracted the congregation from the music. They felt like it was more, or from the worship service, I should say. They felt like it was more theatrical than anything. They felt like if you were creating music, if you were singing words, and those words were worshiping God. So that was okay. But playing instrumental music, there was no real reason for that. It was just a distraction or a worldly pleasure or something like that. Okay, good. So we get to a style of music that's the first style of music we're going to talk about in the Middle Ages. The official music of the Roman Catholic Church all the way up until about the 1960s. So from the 5th century all the way into the 20th century, we have a style of music. And what do we call that music? It's actually on this page a couple times. Yeah, Gregorian chant. A Gregorian chant is the first style of music that we're going to look at. And this music was the official music of the Roman Catholic Church. This is what the monks were singing. So that piece of music that we listen to as our daily listening today was a Gregorian chant written by Hildegard in the 12th century. So a little bit later in the Gregorian chant tradition. But Gregorian chant goes all the way back to about the 5th century and was passed down primarily orally. The monks would sing this Gregorian chant and they would teach each other these songs that they were coming up with. Okay. Now, Gregorian chant is all Gregorian chant has one specific texture, and it's that same texture that we saw with the Hildegard piece. So what is the texture there? It's monophonic. Yeah. Even if you had hundreds of monks singing a Gregorian chant, which you generally wouldn't, it would be like maybe 10, but it was all still going to be monophonic. There was one melody being sung by these monks, and they would teach these melodies orally. They would pass them down by singing them to one another, and then they would learn them and memorize them that way. Yeah, good. And there's a guy named Pope Gregory that they're actually named after. The Gregorian chants are named after Pope Gregory. Why do we call that Gregorian chant then? What is it about Pope Gregory, sometimes called Gregory the Great, that makes us name Gregorian chant after him? Is it because he wrote the music? Or what? Not because he was a composer. In fact, most of our Gregorian chant is anonymous. We don't know who composed most of it. So Pope Gregory was the Pope from 590 to 604, and his biggest contribution to the church was that he organized the church liturgy. Does anybody know what liturgy is in a church, especially the Catholic Church? What is the liturgy of a church?
Readings.
Yeah, you're on the right track.
Yeah, I just can't get it out.
It's the parts of the church service. That is the liturgy, the different parts. So Pope Gregory was the one that organized the church service. Most of your churches that come out of the Catholic or the Anglican church tradition, which the Anglican church is really just a spur of the or was not a spur, but it was a copy of the Catholic Church, just without the central power of the Pope. And the churches to come out of the Anglican tradition are churches like the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Methodists. Those churches tend to follow a specific liturgy. They have all of the different parts of the worship service. So if you go to a Presbyterian church, you're going to see this kind of rundown of all of the different stuff that we do in the Presbyterian church. And especially you're going to see that in the Catholic Church. You have all these different parts of the Catholic Church that you have every single week. Okay, and later on we're going to talk about how we name those and what we call them. But Pope Gregory is the one that kind of organized that together and organized it as every church service should have these different parts. We're going to do the sacrament, and we're going to have the reading of the Lord's Prayer, and we're going to say, we're going to sing these specific songs. So that's one of the reasons why we call it Gregorian chant, because it became an official part of the Catholic Church under Pope Gregory, this kind of music. Okay? Melodically, how do Gregorian chants tend to move, especially early Gregorian chants? They all have a very similar type of motion.
Monophonic.
That's the texture, is monophonic.
So they're saying without music. So what this explain?
So the way that the melodies tend to move is that the melodies tend to move in stepwise motion. So a lot of the melodies of Gregorian chant are going to move up and down the scales. So they're going to move by stepwise motion from one letter name to the next. And there's not a lot of leaps in the melodies. You don't see a lot of wide gaps in the melodic motion of Gregorian chants. And I believe that brings us to, so that brings us to our first daily listening for the middle, or our first listening assignment for the Middle Ages. And this is Alleluia Vidimus Stellam. And I am going to pull up the actual listening outline from the textbook for us to kind of follow along with this piece of music. Is that page 70?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I not?
It starts on page 68. Talks about it.
Ah, there we go, yeah. Okay, so let me share this part of the screen with you guys. Okay, so let's have a listen to this short piece. And if you've got your textbook open, you can go ahead and read a little bit about it, and you should see the listening guide kind of follow along here. So I'm going to turn off my mic while we listen to it, because you guys should get the audio directly from the computer for this. So here is Vidimus Stellum, which means we have seen his.
Oh, and you're on mic.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks, Kate. Sorry about that. Okay, so on page 70 of the book, you've got some of the information about this, so you can kind of figure out what we're talking about here, and even before that. So in what century was this piece written? I'm sorry, not in what century. What is the texture of this piece of music? Monophonic, right? You're going to get tired of me here asking those questions, but it's important to understand the texture of the music. So monophonic music. This is an example of Gregorian chant, which was primarily monophonic. Good? So this piece uses church modes instead of regular major and minor scales like we're used to today. Those didn't become popular until later on. So what is the difference between church modes and major or minor scales? This is on page like 68 of the textbook, I believe, down towards the bottom.
I think you have 7 different tones, and the 8th tone that duplicates the first octave.
Okay, that's how they're similar. So that's just like a scale. They have 7 different tones, with the 8th tone being the octave up, but the patterns of whole steps and half steps are different from the major and minor scales. So the pattern that it's built on is different than the major or minor scales. So this piece, for example, I believe is written in the Dorian mode. So a major scale or a minor scale in the key of D would sound like this. But this piece is written in the Dorian mode, which sounds like this. There's only one note different, but it is a little bit different, and it does give the piece kind of this almost otherworldly sound to it. And they don't focus the way that we do tonically. They don't rely as much on that first note of the scale. It kind of just moves over those notes. Okay? Good. So if you're looking at the sheet music, or if you're in class looking at it on the board, on page 70 of the textbook, how does the number of notes that you see compare to the syllables that they're singing?
Well, they have to hold their voice very long.
Yeah. So you have a very long syllable being held while they're moving over the notes. So there's a lot more notes than there are syllables. Syllables. I always misspell that word. So if you notice at the beginning, he went, Alleluia. Then he got to the next word. So they're holding one syllable for a very long time, which is called a melisma, where you're holding one syllable. So like just, A in Agius is going to take all these different notes in just that one syllable. Good. Two more questions here. The piece is an example of what kind of music we've just been talking about.
Classical.
Not classical music.
Isn't that Western?
Specific. Be specific. What is the kind of music we were just talking about? In the Middle Ages, monophonic music came from the Catholic Church.
Religion. Christian.
Gregorian chant.
There you go. This is an example of Gregorian chant. Good. And then finally, who composed this piece? Kind of a trick question. Maybe a better question would be, do we know who composed this piece?
Yes.
No.
No, that's the name of the piece.
Oh.
Vidimus Stellum, which means we have seen his star. So like most Gregorian chant, this piece is anonymous. So we do not know who composed this piece of music. All right, start the recording here. So we are today going to start with secular music of the Middle Ages, which is going to start us off about the 12th century or so. Most of the records of music that we know about from the Middle Ages came from the church music that we talked about last time we met on Wednesday. And that would be like the Gregorian chant that we went over, the music that was coming from the church. We do know that there was other music going on during that time, but we don't know anything about it. All we have are like a few images, maybe like some paintings and things like that that have survived, and some written descriptions of the music, but we don't really know much else about it. There's no way to recreate that music. The earliest notated music that we have is Gregorian chant, so that's the earliest we can kind of go back and listen to. But this kind of shifts us into secular music and the first type of secular music that we have written down. And first off, what does that term mean? What is secular music?
Anything that is not written for the church.
Yeah, secular music is non-religious music. That's all that means. Now, some people, you may have grown up being taught that secular music is bad music or is evil music, and that's not necessarily true. It's now, if you believe it's bad music or worldly music is bad, that's fine. But the definition of secular music is just that it's specifically not religious music. It's not music written specifically for the church. You have this, you have sacred music and secular music, and those are a little bit different. Okay. So the primary writing of secular music in the 12th century, the earliest records that we have of secular music, came from these French nobles in the 12th century who were these poet musicians who wrote songs. And what do we call those? What are they called? Does anybody know the name of those? Troubadours, yeah. So the troubadours were actually these poet musicians who were writing the music, and then that music would be performed by traveling touring musicians that were called minstrels. So the noble people didn't actually go out and tour around singing their own songs. They wrote music for other people to sing and perform, and this notation was very simple notation. It really only included the melodies. It didn't include the rhythm that it should be played in or sung in. It didn't include specific instruments to be used or anything like that. It only included the melodies. It didn't really include anything else. So this secular music, we had a lot of vocal music as we did in the church, but then in the secular side, we also had some instrumental music that we have record of. We have some written instrumental music that we know would have been performed, and the instrumental music would have only had one particular function. And what is that? Why would instrumental music have existed back then? It was not purely for entertainment or anything like that. If you heard instrumental music, it was primarily as an accompaniment for dancing. So it only really existed for dancing. So most of the instrumental music during this time tends to be very upbeat. It tends to have kind of a strict rhythm to it when we play it. Although that rhythm is not written down, we can kind of tell by the melody that was written the idea behind it, how it would have probably been performed. And we also know from some oral traditions of some of these songs being passed down, by the time we did start writing down rhythms, some people kind of transcribed these traditional instrumental dance pieces. So we have a pretty good idea of what they would have sounded like. Good. And this first large body of notated secular music that was written down that we can actually study comes from, as I said, about the 12th and 13th centuries. Okay, so the 12th and 13th centuries or so is when we had the first written down music. And in the secular song side of things, since these were non-religious songs, they would have various topics. So there were love songs or songs about the Crusades, adventure songs, songs about dancing or other kinds of spinning songs that you might have during this time. And some of these vocal songs didn't really have a clear meter or beat to them. They were very similar to Gregorian chant. A lot of them had kind of taken influence from Gregorian chant, but they just used the secular topics to sing about. And one example of that is this piece by Beatrice, who is one of these troubadours. She is a French noblewoman during this time, who was a troubadour who wrote some music that still exists, that we still have records of some of this stuff. So what do we? Well, first off, let's listen to this piece of music. And if you want to check in your textbook to kind of follow along with this stuff, we are on, let's see, about page 60, about page 73 or so is where they talk about Beatrice and they talk about this song. And then the vocal music guide is actually on the next page, is on page 75, down towards the bottom. And that's what we're going to pull up and listen to here in class. So let me switch over to sharing the screen. And this would be what, the third piece in the listening assignment? Somebody that's got it pulled up? All right. So we're actually just going to listen to like the first half of this. The whole second half of it, or really second 3/4 of it, is just an instrumental kind of improvisation. So you really only need to know about this first part here. Instrumental stuff. Okay, so let's look at some of the questions that we have about this troubadour song. First off, Beatrice is a female troubadour. And what do we call a female troubadour? We have a special term for them. Yeah, troubarites. And I'll type that out for you. Good. So when you were listening to this piece of music, could you feel a steady beat or meter? Was it a piece of music that you could tap your foot to? No, it was very free flowing, right? So it was more like the Gregorian chant. There's not really a clear rhythm or anything like that. Good. What is the name? So this piece has the melody, which we know would have been written down, but there's also an improvised part that we're pretty sure the medieval Middle Ages instrumentalists, musicians would have added to this. And what is that instrument that accompanies the melody throughout this?
Kind of like a bagpipe or something.
It does, and the book actually tells us what the name of that instrument is. It's called a vielle. It's actually a string instrument that's droning. It's a predecessor to the viol or the an early violin called the vielle. So this is a string instrument that kind of looked like and is played similar to a violin, but it's a much larger instrument. It's actually closer in shape to like a dobro or a hammer dulcimer or something. Good. So reading the translation, the English translation of the lyrics, what is Beatrice singing about here? Love, right? It's a sad love song. I always say this is like 12th century Taylor Swift, right? She's had a bad breakup and she's writing a song about it. And finally, what is the language of this song? What is this song written in? Most of the troubadours were from what country? France. Yeah, so this it's going to be written in French. But rather than the Latin that we saw with the Gregorian chant, this one is written in French. And we are eventually going to get some English stuff in here as well, I promise. It takes a little while to get there. In fact, actually in the Renaissance, we'll have, so next week we'll have a couple of English songs that we'll hear. Okay, good. The next piece that I want to look at is an instrumental piece of secular music called an estampie. And this is a very, very short piece of music here. Now, as I said, most music, in fact, I'm not even going to share the listening guide because there's really not much to it. You can find in your book where the different instruments that it talks about there. So an estampie is a kind of dance. So this is going to have a dance feel to it. It's got a triple meter. So you're going to hear this fast 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 kind of feel. And there's an instrument called the psaltery that is playing this sort of drone underneath it that's keeping the steady beat. That 1, 2, 1, 2, and it almost sounds like a guitar, but it only has 2 strings. So here is the estampie. So a nice quick little dance tune. So speaking of, what is an estampie? What does that mean? But an estampie is just a dance. That's all that means. It's a dance song. It's a French word for dance. It's specifically a medieval dance. Thank you. Look at that. Somebody even typed it into the thing there. I didn't have to do all the work. Good. And I mentioned a minute ago, what meter is this tune in? A triple meter, yeah. It's got a triple meter feel to it. Excellent. And we have a melody that's played on two instruments called a rebec and a pipe. So the rebec is another string instrument, kind of a predecessor to the violin or fiddle or something like that. And then a pipe is like an early flute. But then that melody is accompanied by another instrument playing another musical term there that we talked about even the other day. What is that called? The instrument is the psaltery. And what is the psaltery playing? It's just two notes over and over again. And what do we call that when you have just a low note ringing through the whole thing? I'm sorry? It does. A drone, yeah. So drones are very common in medieval music. We don't really have full-blown harmony or anything like that yet in this music. Instead, we just have these low drones with melodies over the top of them, and there's going to be a bunch of that in the the Middle Ages and the Renaissance music. Good. Next question, does the manuscript for this specify an instrument that's supposed to play it? No, it does not. And as we mentioned earlier, what part of the song would have been written on the sheet music? As with most medieval music, they would have only written out the... I'm sorry? Yeah, they would have only written out the melody. They would not have written out that drone part or anything, the rhythm or anything else. They would have just written out the notes of the melody, and it would be performed or improvised by the musicians. All right, good. Okay, so after the 12th century or so, in the church, we have a little bit of a development in music. We start to see music start to evolve and change. And actually, organum actually came around earlier than that, going all the way back to about the 8th century, the 9th century. We started to see in Gregorian chant, they added this, they created this kind of organum, which is a term that means what? Anybody have that definition? Yeah, we take Gregorian chant and we're going to add additional melodic lines to it. So we're starting to approach polyphony for the first time. We're moving away from just that single melody line that everybody is singing in a monophonic style, a monophonic texture. We're starting to add some second parts to it. At first, it's just a harmony part. We're just singing the same Gregorian chant at a parallel pitch. So, for instance, the Alleluia that we listened to the other day, the melody was something like that. So in addition to that, we would add probably like a fourth above that. Let's see if I can do this. Gosh. So it's doing the same melody just at a specific interval, or they might have done a fifth above it that would sound like this. But then we eventually start seeing some other lines being added to it in what is called counterpoint, where you have a slower moving line maybe below that main melody. it's very free flowing. It has this very kind of otherworldly feel to it. It doesn't sound normal to us. So they start slowly adding in these other lines. And where is it that we start to see polyphony start to develop in Europe? What city became kind of the main hub of polyphonic music during this time period?
Was it Paris?
It was. You're absolutely right. So it starts to develop after about 1150 in Paris, and specifically at the Notre Dame Cathedral. So we call it the School of Notre Dame. It was there that we have a couple of composers named Léonin and Periton who start to help develop polyphony, and they really become the first composers to be known by name around Europe, to be recognized by name. So people start coming to Paris specifically to learn from Léonin and Periton, or they start to try to find Gregorian chant, or not even Gregorian chant anymore. They start to try to find this new polyphonic music written specifically by Léonin and Periton. And they develop an idea called a cantus firmus, which is where you take the Gregorian chant as the basis for the polyphony, and then you add stuff on top of it. So the cantus firmus would be that melodic line, that original Gregorian chant, that is then turned into basically a bass line. It's then sung really slow, and then you have this other polyphonic music happening over the top of it. Okay? So Léonin and Periton are notable for a couple of reasons. They were the first composers to become famous during their time period, of course. And they were also the first composers to notate rhythm. So they started writing out specific rhythms in their music. And then we also start to see in the School of Notre Dame around the 12th, 13th century that composers start to use modern sounding triads. We start to finally hear chords that sound like the kind of music that we listen to. It's still not fully tonal like we have. They still do some interesting things with it, but it is, we at least are starting to hear the thirds being built upon as these kind of consonant chords. All right, now the book kind of, if I remember right, the book doesn't actually give us an example of Léonin and Periton's music, but I do want to play just a little bit of it before we get to Michaud, because we have a little bit of time. So this would be an example of Léonin's chant music. Let me see if I can find a better example. Here we go. So this would be an example of like 13th century organum. So really beautiful music, I think. I'm going to find some specific paratone. So this would be Periton's music. So we're finally starting to get some other stuff happening at the same time. It's not just a chant. So we're approaching some early polyphony here at this point. All right. So in the 14th century, we start to see that secular music becomes more popular than sacred music for the first time. And there's a few reasons for that. What are some of those reasons? It wasn't based on Gregorian chant anymore. But that's not necessarily the reason why it becomes more popular. That's just another. The secular music moves away from Gregorian chant, but the main reason that it becomes less popular is because the church itself is losing power. So the church isn't controlling everything anymore. So the instrumentalist musicians are more free to compose the way they want to compose. It doesn't have to be religious music anymore at this point. So we do start to see it change a little bit. And there's a term that we use for these 14th century style of music, these new changes in music. What is that term? The new art is specifically called the Ars Nova, which means new art. Yeah. So if you hear the term Ars Nova, it's specifically talking about the new music of the 14th century. It's kind of the modern music of the 14th century during this time. Good. And in the 14th century, we start to see some new rhythmic practices becoming popular. And there's a term that we've talked about way back in when we talked about dynamics and some of that stuff in rhythm that becomes very popular in the 14th century and is actually going to define the music of about the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. You may know that term off the top of your head? Syncopation, yeah. And what is syncopation? So syncopation is where accents happen on off beats or unexpected beats. So like that Periton piece that we listened to, where you had a lot of dee dee da dee da da dee da 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 da, that is syncopated music. And this music that we're going to listen to here in a little bit does have that feel to it. Okay. All right, so we get to a composer who's a very important composer of the 14th century, Guillaume de Machaut, who is a French composer of the 14th century, and he is notable because he wrote both secular and sacred music. So we actually have two pieces by him that we're going to listen to. One of them is a secular piece, and one of them is a sacred piece. And the secular piece that we're going to listen to first is actually one of my favorite pieces of the medieval era. And I guess it's probably because it's later in the medieval era that I like it so much. And this is a piece called Puisqu'on oublie. And it took me a long time to be able to pronounce even just that first line in French. My French is really awful. So Puisqu'on oublie, suis de vous, as it's sometimes called, which is since I am forgotten by you. And this is a really beautiful piece of music that starts to, we're hearing this early form of polyphony with this. So we have some early polyphonic stuff happening here. And let's just listen to it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Right, so that is the song Puisqu'on oublie by Michaud. So a couple of things you need to know about this piece. First off, is it secular or sacred? It is secular. He is not singing religious music. Good. What is the texture of this piece?
His voice is really deep.
Is it polyphonic, homophonic, or monophonic? How many parts did you hear in there? So you have a melody with harmony underneath it, and the harmony parts aren't really singing individual melodic lines. So we would call it homophonic because it is a melody with harmony. Okay? What is the mood of this piece? It's a sad piece, yeah. And I think the book specifically calls it melancholy. It's a very melancholic piece. Good. So you have, as I said, one vocal melody and two lower harmony parts. And we actually, from the original manuscript, we're actually not sure if those were meant to be played on instruments or if they were meant to be sung. We assume that because they were so low that they were supposed to be sung because there weren't a lot of instruments that would play those low notes at the time, but we don't know that for sure. Good. And there's a specific French form that is the form of this piece. Did anybody find what that's called?
Rondo.
Yeah, this is a rondo form, which is a French poetic and musical form during this time. It alternates back and forth. There's 8 lines, and they alternate back and forth between 2 different melodies, and one of the melodies always ends with the French syllable mis, and another one always ends with the French syllable mont. So they kind of go back and forth in this rhyming pattern. All right, and we're going to end today with an Agnus Dei by Michaud. So this is another piece by Michaud, but this time it's going to be a sacred piece, a piece that is sung for church and is specifically part of a Catholic Mass. It's part of what we call the Mass Ordinary. And we'll talk much more about the Mass Ordinary a little bit later on. But first, let's have a listen. And this time I'm going to share the vocal guide with us on the screen here. All right, we don't necessarily have to listen to that whole thing to get the idea there. All right, so first off, what does Agnus Dei mean? What is the English translation of that is Lamb of God. And why is this piece written in Latin instead of French?
Religious freedom. No.
What were you saying?
Religious freedom.
Well, not necessarily religious freedom. It's because it's a religious piece, and religious music was all written in Latin at that point. Good. How do the upper parts, the upper melodic parts, compare to the lower melodic parts in this tune? Yeah, the upper parts are more rhythmic and syncopated, while the lower parts are very slow held notes. Very good. All right, now, as I said, this is part of the Catholic Mass Ordinary, which has 5 sections to it. And this is an exam question, so I want to make sure that we talk about it. So what are those 5 different parts of the Catholic Mass that are songs. Did you find that in the text? So the Agnus Dei is going to be one of them. Anybody know any of the others? You're telling me we don't have any Catholics in this class? So we have the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, and the Sanctus, and then the Agnus Dei. So those 5 sections will all show up in the Catholic Mass. Okay. Is there a question on the listening assignment that I didn't put on this? What is it? Oh, the characteristic. Yeah, that's an opinion thing. That's why I didn't put it on here. So you can list that on your own. How you feel, what you feel the characteristic of this piece is. Okay. Does anybody have any questions in the last 2 minutes? So make sure that you get part 1 finished or part 2, chapter 1. So there's 2 assignments, assignment 2.1 and listening assignment 2.1. Make sure you get those done by midnight tonight, and we will talk about the Renaissance on Monday and Wednesday. All right, hope you guys have a good weekend.